Hello, everyone. Welcome. We are going to maybe give one more minute for folks to join, and then we will get started with our first breakout presentation. Okay, folks are still trickling in, but I'm going to go ahead and kick us off. Welcome to the Social Workers Confronting Racial Injustice Conference 2026. I'm Angela Willits, and I'm happy you're here for this breakout presentation titled Psychedelic Care Rooted in Abolitionist and Racial Justice. To share a visual description of me, I'm a middle-aged white woman with glasses and brown curly hair, and I'm wearing a gray sweater, and I'm currently in my home office in Mount Horeb, Wisconsin. I'd like to take a moment to share our university's land acknowledgement. The University of Wisconsin-Madison and the Sandra Rosenbaum School of Social Work occupy ancestral Ho-Chunk land, a place their nation has called Dajope since time immemorial. In an 1832 treaty, the Ho-Chunk were forced to cede this territory. Decades of ethnic cleansing followed when both the federal and state government repeatedly, but unsuccessfully, sought to forcibly remove the Ho-Chunk from Wisconsin. The history of colonization informs our shared future of collaboration and innovation, and today UW-Madison respects the inherent sovereignty of the Ho-Chunk Nation, along with the 11 other First Nations of Wisconsin. Now, a few Zoom reminders. This presentation is being recorded and will be available on our conference website at a later date. To access this presentation, you are required to provide your name and email. This will allow us to log our attendees and email you information on CEUs for this presentation. And those CEUs will be distributed via email at a later date. So no worries about CEUs. Logging in gives us all the information that we need in order to get those to you. Your cameras and microphones will remain muted, but we have a Q&A feature where you will do our best with that. Now it's my pleasure to introduce you to our presenter, Ronica Mukerjee, and to welcome Ronica back because they have presented at this conference before. Ronica is a family and psychiatric mental health nurse practitioner, as well as an acupuncturist. Dr. Mukerjee is currently an assistant professor and provides both hormonal care and psychiatric care for trans and gender diverse patients. Dr. Mukerjee's book about abolition and health justice, All of This Safety is Killing Us, was published last year by North Atlantic Books. So Veronica, on that, I will turn it over to you. Thank you so much for being here.
Great. Thank you so much. And thank you to UW-Madison for inviting me. It's a little awkward for me to do a description of myself, but I will try. I am an AFAB, genderqueer, South Asian person with short, blonde, lots of gray hair. And I'm wearing a multicolored shirt that's predominantly brown with a brown and black necklace. And I'm in my acupuncture and ketamine practice space in Dumbo, Brooklyn, in New York. Okay, I'm going to share my slides. Great. Can you all see that, Angela? Or
yes, we can. Yep, it looks perfect.
Just making sure. So we're in a really kind of horrifying time where, when I think about abolition, when I think about the sort of origins of abolition, we know where they come from. It comes from fighting enslavement of human beings. especially in this country, but also in other countries in the world. And because we know that prisons and police are very closely tied to prisons and to slavery, including the construction of those institutions themselves, abolition has now become really looking at those institutions as well as the way that borders affect people who are living in this country and also beyond, trying to come to this country as well. Yeah, so just to see that we are now seeing a resurgence of the Black Panther Party. It's not that the Black Panther Party really ever went away. There's always been Black Panther parties all over the United States, but there are starting to be more and more chapters that are more visible in cities all over this country. And also for me to acknowledge my fellow nurse, Alex Preddy, who was murdered by ICE last week. So some loose topicking of what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about what we're doing in psychedelics right now, what's happening, what I see as places of change, which I put very simply as what's wrong with it. And then looking at psychedelics through queer, trans, BIPOC, disability justice lens, kind of a little bit of a context of what we know. And also before this, we're going to look at the history of legalization and what it's meant, sort of production and legalization of psychedelics and other drugs too, because we need to treat all drugs the same. And then we'll talk a little bit about what are the goals for abolition in psychedelics. And we'll start by defining abolition itself. So what is abolition in the context of medicine? Sorry, I need to make myself smaller. There we go. So abolition is really about eradicating imprisonment, policing, detention, surveillance, and really all of the systems that create less access to freedom in our lives. And then creating lasting alternatives to punishment, deportation, incarceration. A lot of people will ask the question, well, if we didn't have prisons, what would we do with all of the people who are, terrible people? They kill people randomly, or they're, serial killers. Like this is a lot of what people question when, specifically I do my book talks, and they are not ready for the idea of abolition. And what I would say is, we eradicated slavery. We used to say, farmers used to say, well, we could never pick cotton unless we had slaves. And yet now there are many, many solutions to picking cotton in the United States. And so we have to come up with those solutions together. And of course, there are people working on that already. But reaching for those solutions versus reaching for the systems that already exist is part of the abolitionist methodology. Sorry, having an issue. Okay. An abolitionist health justice is correctly seeing that carceral systems are the root of many health inequities and disparities, and that as healthcare providers, mental health care providers, our focus for people who are affected and even people who don't know that they're affected is on removing barriers, including carceral ones, to healthcare in order to improve health outcomes for all. Why do we have police in hospitals? Why do we think that patients are the cause of distress as opposed to people who are coming because they are in distress and so may not be acting their best? And why haven't we created systems beyond carceral ones to address the vulnerabilities and maybe inappropriate behavior sometimes that people express within hospital settings? It's also understanding that increasingly people's lives are legal battles. We know this is true right now because of racialized targeting of particularly Latin people in this country, but also people from African countries, um, less East Asian and South Asian countries, but that is also happening. Immigration status makes people targets, queerness or transness. Now people are being told that they can't continue to write and that they are enemies of the state. They're being sent letters to cease and desist because they write about queer and trans topics. That we need to think about abortion access as a place where people's lives are becoming increasingly illegal, disability experience, and also mental health differences, exposing people to carceral systems at a much greater rate than other people. For clinicians, this means no policing our patients for whether or not they're taking their medications, whether or not it's antipsychotics or diabetes meds or substances that we don't agree with them taking, and never calling police or ICE because there is a crisis. And that includes in situations where you suspect there's neglect of a child. Like, it is complicated and life is complicated, but police create very clear problems, especially for communities of color. When we see people, when we're taking care of people, we need to ask, how are carceral systems affecting my patients, clients, and how is systematic exclusion operating? And I think this is particularly true when we're talking about psychedelics. When we are in a room with somebody who holds very different identities than us, and we need to understand how systematic oppression affects that person and how that it affects their ability to feel comfortable within a psychedelic experience. So let's talk a little bit about the history of some drugs. We won't talk about every drug because we don't have time, but we'll talk about some of them. And I found these advertisements endlessly amusing because first of all, they're both targeted at children. And it's not like we never give opiates to children, but it's pretty uncommon outside of a hospital setting. But cocaine tooth drops, laudanum. And, the thing you can absolutely notice here is that they're very much targeted at white people, right? It's like white children have tooth pain and white women are beleaguered by the fact that their children are having, I mean, first of all, yellow fever. I'm not sure opium's a good treatment for that. I mean, maybe. Um, they're having pain or cardiac disease or colds or dysentery. I mean, yes, opium will constipate you. And excessive secretions their children are having. So you can see that the advertising was all over the place. And these medications, because they produce a lot of bodily reactions, were absolutely used for medicinal purposes, because it's almost like people gave them magical qualities because they were like, we know our children shut up when they take this medication. We know our children have happier expressions on their face when they have a toothache. So these medications were considered very useful for a time. And when we talk about the substances, I mean, one major thing I really want to bring up is that there is this racialization of substances. And I only put some on here because of time, but and our focus. But one of the major sort of legal targeting eras was the 1870s, which was when Chinese communities who were largely poor, largely working as laborers in or around the railroad, but also stores, lots of other, kind of blue collar jobs, were targeted as like corrupting white women with opium. But the truth was that the opium tradition in China is very, very old, and largely the use of opium from Chinese sellers was within Chinese communities, and then white people who would enter into the Chinese communities. But actually, the use of opium in white communities was largely led by Europeans, and that opium was brought in by Europeans into white communities. It was often used medicinally, often in patients, medicines and tonics for coughs, pain, and sleep. Um, but this recreational opium smoking became racialized, and authorities started associating it with Chinese immigrants and criminality rather than the white middle class use of opiates in medicine. And that's a theme that we'll see, especially with cocaine. When we talk about cocaine versus crack cocaine, which is lower down, the first sort of cocaine bans came around Black men. And that, the idea was, and this was in the 1900s, that Black men became violent and superhuman and inhuman, and were terrifying, and so therefore we needed to ban cocaine. However, we know that over time cocaine is really a drug of white middle class or upper middle class communities. That's really who uses cocaine in the United States, in contrast to crack cocaine. um, and so crack cocaine, the people who've been targeted, especially in the 80s, were Black communities. And we know that there was pumping of cocaine. It's been historically proven that there was pumping of crack cocaine into Black communities by COINTELPRO and other government organizations seeking to disrupt Black power movements. And Black people were portrayed as predators. There was the myth of the crack baby, which we now know is completely untrue, which, those babies were suffering from malnutrition because of poverty. And so then we had these mandatory minimums that were set up, but also the Fair Sentencing Act, which at first crack was prosecuted at 100-1 with cocaine in terms of sentencing. And then under the Fair Sentencing Act, which happened under Obama in the 90s, the 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 prosecution of crack became, the numbers sort of differ. There's people who say 35-1, there's people who say 20-1, there's people who say 18-1, but it's roughly 35, something like 35 grams of crack equals 500 grams of cocaine in terms of the level of sentencing that happens for people. And this is racialized because crack is much rarer in white communities, especially white urban communities, more common in white rural communities. Marijuana, the anti-cannabis laws started in 1910, and the sort of banning started with this criminalization of Mexicans who are portrayed as criminal or lazy. And then there was the Marijuana Tax Act, which was, sort of the latter part of Prohibition, and that continued, marijuana to scheduling, although now the scheduling is very varied from state to state. And that partially, there's a lot of conversation around that. The reason that marijuana is as legal as it is because of how common it is used in white communities. MDMA we'll talk about more, but there's really much history to say that the reason it was made illegal was because of its usage in urban BIPOC and queer and trans communities, with the stereotype that, people were immoral, they were having this uncontrolled pleasure, and it was, made Schedule 1 in 1988. LSD, psilocybin has other psychedelics have been associated with anti-war, indigenous, Black liberation activists, so, social upheaval and rebellion. So they were pretty much all made Schedule 1 in 1970, although there were some like sort of precursor laws too, and we'll talk about that with LSD specifically. But the Controlled Substance Act is when they became Schedule 1. And throughout history, the way that drug users have been portrayed, and this is true with psychedelics as well, is that the reason we're giving psychedelics or any other medication is that white people are sick, they need treatment. With psychedelics, we can say that what we're doing is treating everybody, but that's not actually what's happening. For the most part, the people who receive psychedelic treatment, 80% or above, are white. And so it's again, white people who are depressed, who have mental illness, who are receiving these treatments because they are, in need of medical treatment, while everybody else is using these drugs in the underground. They're victims of circumstance. They're traumatized. And also, there's the college students experimenting. When you think of the college students experimenting with drugs, there's a very specific face to that, and it is not a person of color. BIPOC users are often framed as, and BIPOC, I'm sure you all know, as Black, Indigenous, people of color, framed as dangerous, morally defective, criminally inclined. And there are sentencing disparities that have just been noted even by the Bureau of Justice Statistics, that people of color receive unequal sentencing for all drugs, and over policing with less access to treatment versus incarceration. So MDMA we're going to talk a little bit about just two psychedelics, MDMA and LSD, and sort of like the historical context of it. So MDMA, which was manufactured in 1912 by Merck, was used widely in therapy and in underground communities in the 70s and 80s, but it became increasingly popular in the 80s, particularly in like queer and trans rave parties, like the sort of, it wasn't like drag queens started existing in the 80s, but it became this sort of popular dance movement, 70s and 80s, and exploration of gender. And then in 1985, it was criminalized. There's like an emergency Schedule 1. And in 1986, even though there was a judge who suggested Schedule 3, which would make it much more accessible, the DEA overruled that judge. And that judge was actually part of the DEA. And it's interesting to think about the fact that MDMA was created in 1912, because it went through but it was created as a sort of intermediate compound that was never intended for human usage. And of course, the military studied it in the 1950s and 1960s to see whether or not it could have psychological effects, such as like truth serum or, being able to be a better soldier. But you can imagine that MDMA is not that great at making people better soldiers. And what's I going to say about this? And so, now then we have this resurgence of FDA approved trials happening. And then there was the Lycos trial, which, 2024, 2025, it was brought to the FDA, sorry. And it was denied because of these unethical practices, where there was not only sexual misconduct, where one of the participants sued the two of the principal investigators, but also study participants were coaxed to then report their results as better. Once they had already reported, they were asked to come back and re-report their results as, having higher benefits than they actually had originally reported. So, and they were told that this was so that there would be more access to the medication. And I think there's a lot of people who think that MAPS, PBC, now Lycos, they are the people who brought MDMA to the market. And the FDA is declining. And, I'm no fan of the FDA. That's not where we're going here. But the truth is that what Lycos proposed, it was MAPS PBC at the time, proposed was their protocol. They had a therapeutic protocol that was associated with MDMA, and that the only way that therapists, anybody else, would have access to the MDMA was if they were trained by MAPS PBC. So they would have to go through an expensive training process that MAPS would benefit from, Lycos, in order to be able to have access to MDMA. So it's a little more complicated than we didn't get MDMA. There's a lot of politics and money involved in the not being able to have MDMA in the market, and it was never going to be in the market freely. But it is true that MDMA was criminalized before there were formal safety trials, unlike most medications, and that the scheduling was driven more by cultural panic. And there's much historical context to this, the connection with counterculture, queer and gender diverse communities, and association with uncontrolled pleasure than by scientific analysis. Let's talk about LSD. So LSD was created by Albert Hofmann in 1938 because the only names we can know in psychedelics are white men. That's actually not true. I think one of the more famous people in psychedelics is Maria Sabina, who is credited with connecting with American Western scientists and introducing them to psilocybin. And unlike any of these other scientists that we're talking about or companies that we're talking about, she died in poverty after her house was burned down by her community because of Western encroachment in Oaxaca. And so, when we think about the commercialization of psychedelics, we can also know that indigenous communities have been very negatively affected by the psychedelics movement, what is currently considered the sort of mainstream psychedelics movement. So anyway, back to LSD. LSD was created by Albert Hofmann in 1938. And in the 1950s and 1960s, it became the symbol of generational and political dissent. And to note that in 1943, the psychedelic effects were discovered when he ingested it accidentally. And of course, once again, there was military research to see in the 1950s and 1960s whether or not the CIA or US military could use this substance as a truth serum, a mind control agent, a psychological warfare tool, but it wasn't good at that. It was good at sort of expanding horizons for people that it did that for. And that meant that it became part of countercultural movements because scientists are often countercultural, not always, obviously not always, but when they are, it can be really beneficial to our communities. And so there was all this countercultural and other spread, and there are many people who think that psychedelics, including LSD, were part of fueling generational and political dissent, anti-war activism. And there were all of these media accounts that portrayed, just as is happening now, people who were counterculture as being crazy and, suicidal and wanting to jump out of windows, and that there was, social disorder as a result of countercultural movements that were also associated with psychedelic usage. So in 1966, LSD was banned federally and was made Schedule 1 in 1970. And then in the 1990s, we had more research start. But the LSD prohibition fits this broader US pattern, which is that substances that are used by marginalized or oppositional groups are criminalized, and substances that are tied to elite or corporate power, like alcohol or, tobacco, pharmaceuticals, are regulated. And also, I think the Canadian picture is really interesting, which is that this is in 1962. It was a few years after 1962. So it was like the whole thalidomide scandal, which, caused birth differences in children. Um, there was LSD was being used in Canada and the United States by therapists to treat alcohol use disorder. And it was, we know now from the research, the more current research, that it is an efficacious tool for this. And they found, well, it's an efficacious tool in some trials. Let's just say that. But so in Canada, the research was really positive. And so Senator Molson, which, if that sounds familiar to you, it should. It's Molson Brewery. Senator Heartland Molson of the Molson Brewery family basically recommended that it become illegal. And because, of all of this stuff that we're talking about, but obviously there's a really specific political interest here. And yeah, so he pushed this law forward in order to make LSD illegal and no longer available to be used for alcohol use disorder treatment. Okay, so that was some history not on the slides. I think it's always interesting to think about this history because one of the things archaeologists argue is that psychedelics are responsible for human evolution, and that it's possible that, and maybe not every archaeologist or anthropologist would say this, but that tool usage was increased as a result of interaction with DMT-like or psilocybin containing, you know, fungi and creatures and plants. So when we think about it that way, what are we missing in our lives when we are not able to consider our own evolution because of the laws that currently exist that make it dangerous and difficult for us to access these substances? So that said, what's happening now in the world of psychedelics? What are we doing? What does it look like? Is it efficacious? And what's my suggestion? So similar to therapy, the way we think about, so most of us are going to work in ketamine because that is the substance that is legal in every state in this country because it's also used for anesthesia. And for the people who choose to do so, you can also either, work in underground communities or get trained and work in Colorado or Oregon with other substances, including psilocybin. You could work in a church that's specifically ayahuasca or peyote connected. And really the goals that we are taught to think about with psychedelics is that we are trying to decrease suffering. We're trying to decrease people's depressive or anxious symptoms so that they are more able to cope. We're interested in facilitating healing of trauma, which, obviously is a long process for many people, but, the hope is with psychedelics that we're sort of taking a jump forward. We're hoping to lessen anxiety, amplify self-compassion, and compassion for others too. Although I do think that's less of a focus almost always in psychedelics. It's more about looking at yourself and caring about yourself more. And I hear the argument that it's hard to care about other people when you don't care about yourself. And I do think that's a very Western argument. Also, that the goals are, we see this very commonly, especially in the corporate world, to make more money and remove mental barriers to capital. I was doing a little research on this to think about it in the context of, you know, I hate to even say his name, but the Musks of the world. And one of the things that psychedelic practitioners focus on is trying to decrease ego-driven behavior. But what if that's not what someone wants? And for corporate executives, that's one of the goals, is to decrease ego-driven behavior. But what if that's not what someone is really focused on, or they don't know where their ego is? I think that it can become something that it just amplifies that ego or that drive as well. Feeling more powerful. And, this is the smallest sense of feeling more powerful, actually feeling power in your life, that you are somebody who gets to make your own decisions, and also that your care for people is important, and your role in the world is significant. And it goes all the way to lording over other people and feeling very comfortable choosing to have these positions of power that make other people feel small or decimate communities. Disrupting rigid negative thought patterns, and whether or not that is, again, something very small, like you can't stop saying negative things to yourself about yourself, or it's rigid negative thought patterns that stop you from being able to be as financially successful as you would like to be, or as powerful as you would like to be. Really runs the gamut, and there's people who specialize in different ways. Increasing emotional flexibility and promoting new psychological perspectives. I mean, none of these goals are that different than usual therapeutic techniques. But the hope is that progress can happen faster. And that's often what I tell my ketamine patients, is that what we're hoping for is a little bit of a jump start to get to where you're trying to get emotionally, and maybe skipping a few months of therapy. And therapists say this too. It's not just me. I guess I also do therapy, but that's not my main practice. And so, that's the hope with psychedelics. But the thing that psychedelics do not do, and I think it's very important to know, is they don't make people good. They don't make people compassionate towards other people. And they don't create some, and I've had students who said this before, like, what if I could convince someone to not be, like, I don't know, a tyrannical leader of some type? And unless that is that person's goal, it's very unlikely that you are going to be able to stop someone from achieving or wanting the goals that they want, because psychedelics amplify people's initial intentions. And that's why it's so important, and this is what I always say to patients, to actually do work in between the psychedelic sessions. But for someone who is involved in doing, oppressive things in the world, it also is something they're doing on a daily basis, and it helps to amplify that as well, which is, why I say choose your patients, understanding that you are helping them become a different person. I mean, a different person, the same person, but amplified, and not a different person. Okay. So when we're thinking about it from an abolitionist perspective, I think all of the same goals are true. But I also feel like it's about increasing our relationship to our truest self, communities, also in the natural world. For me, the majority of my patients are trans. I have a lot of other, I have people who have been formerly incarcerated. I'd say almost all of my ketamine patients are Black, Indigenous people of color. And what does it look like to have a relationship to our truest self under white supremacy or under a cis heterosexual supremacy or one that does not recognize disabled bodies? And it really is hard to get to that because we have to get through all the layers of what we hear every single day to try to figure out where we are and not try to fit in. And not trying to fit in can be a source of discomfort too. And yet I do think it is the way to go. Not that we have to intentionally try not to fit in, but that when our gut comes up and says to us, this is wrong, that there is something important there for us to pay attention to. And I think that that does amplify healing versus assimilating, that our goal is not to assimilate into a world that is as toxic and harmful and murderous and death culture as our current culture is, but to actually figure out what it means to have a survival that is enjoyable and worthwhile, and also in opposition to the systems that exist, in whatever ways we feel comfortable being that way. I also think we have lost our relationship to our dreams, our deepest dreams, and that we do not see the world that doesn't make us money, doesn't, make our partner happy as being vital information. And how do we access that knowledge that is within us, that is part of our liminal consciousness, and having more connection to that? Seeing that our anxieties, like how many people am I treating with anxiety in my practice? I would say there's less patients that don't have anxiety. And sure, yes, I do have a psychiatric practice. So you could say maybe lots of other people don't have anxiety. But I think that right now, and a lot of the time, it doesn't have to just be under a fascist regime, but for much of our lives, we have been living in this broken world, and before we were born too. And it is normal to feel anxious and disconnected in this world. So how do we resolve that without having this relationship to our truest self, to our communities that we value, and to the natural world? Amplifying the making of worlds. I think it's very important for us to be proactive about creating worlds and communities that we want to be in, with others. A lot of the Western concepts of psychedelics that we have are individual. Like most of my therapy sessions, my ketamine-assisted psychotherapy sessions are with individual people, but I love doing groups and I do groups too. I think people don't know how to be in therapeutic groups with psychedelics, which is why underground communities are so important. And I think the goal of psychedelics is actual evolution, that we are evolving beyond the systems that we are oppressed by, in resistance to surveilling, in resistance to policing borders and prisons. So what we know is that the palatability politics, like fitting into academia, those things serve white supremacy, and the current environment of psychedelics recreates oppressive structures that are inherent in clinical settings. And when we are just like nice, benign, little bit Midwestern, palatable, that does serve white supremacy. And there's no real room in leadership to challenge white supremacy. I think the furthest we get with this, and we are woe is me about DEI, and I'm not saying DEI is terrible, but DEI is not enough. DEI is a concession to what we actually deserve, which is an environment that includes all of our brains and bodies. And there's no room to challenge that white supremacy for queer, trans people. or people with disabilities. I mean, really, it's white people that can challenge the most, but the rest of us are just kind of like marginally there, and maybe we're not going to make it. And we constantly are holding on to our positions of power with desperation because we are so unused to getting them. And so it's rare that once we're in these positions of power, that we actually choose to challenge these environments. If we fit in and can sublimate ourselves, we are welcome. And when we look at the top 50 academic nursing or social works school in 2020, we see that deans, associate, assistant deans, chairs, vice executive roles, 81% were white in nursing schools and 72% were white in social work schools. And that's also true in psychedelics. It's even more true that 92% of psychedelic research centers, including the one in Madison, had leadership that was white or co-led by white people. These institutions will talk about diversity, but they will never challenge the white cishet able-bodied supremacy that exists within psychedelics. There's no agreement that the end of prisons, borders, policing, and wars against brown and black people are deeply linked to transformative thought. Why have we accepted carceral systems? We need to think beyond carceral systems. How did we come up with carceral systems as the answer to feeling unsafe? It seems like the simplest and most targeted solution we could have come up with. And also, it was about white people and wealthy people feeling unsafe. And why aren't we challenging these things? Because the majority of funding in psychedelics comes from billionaires, and billionaires profit from war. No matter what, they profit from war. Yes, there's also Department of Defense money. Yes, there's also IOF money within psychedelics. And, you know, but the largest amount of funding does come from private donors. If we cannot imagine a world without prisons or racist wars or genocides, then we are amplifying authoritarian regimes. And I don't care how much brain-derived neurotropic factor anyone's brain is making, the world is not becoming better as a result of psychedelic care. So I thought I would show you some pictures of the CEOs of the largest US psychedelic pharmaceutical companies. And I'm wondering, I should do a poll, like if you guys can see anything similar about them. But anyway, so, Lykos is former MAPS PBC, which rebranded after the failure of their proven to not be evidence-based MDMA protocol. Definium, Raw, Barrow. Yeah, they also manufacture psychedelics, and they're predominantly ketamine. Tactogen was started in 2020. They're developing MDMA-like drugs, develop psychoplastogens to treat mental health. And inspired by psychedelics, but their idea is non-hallucinogenic compounds to enhance neuroplasticity. Do I think that's interesting? Yeah, of course, I think that's interesting. But I also, especially for people who have psychotic disorders or bipolar, that's, not well treated with the medications we have. But also, I think that we need to think that the psychedelic experience is important. So, complicated. I'm not saying it's terrible, but like, what are the actual priorities and who's getting the research done? We'll talk about that. And then there's, Delix, another psychoplastogen company. And then Gilgamesh, which is they're developing novel rapid acting psychedelic related therapies. So these are the largest psychedelic companies in the United States. I didn't put a ton on here, but there are a ton of the same pictures to look at, which is the largest US psychedelic retreat and other retreat centers. And I know USONA is not just a retreat center, they do psychedelic funding as well as production of psilocybin. But yeah, they also are headed by white people, but there's women in this. So I think we could be excited about that, I guess. So how do BIPOC people experience or not experience psychedelic studies? So in 39 studies with 1,400 people, 85% of people were non-Latina white, 2.9% were Black, 5.9% were Latina, 3.2%. I mean, the point is 85% were non-Latina white. And I mean, I know 76% is the majority, but I can't believe 24% of studies didn't report race at all. How is that a normal study? How did that study get approved by a journal? Why would you approve an article that doesn't have any racial demographics in it whatsoever, or any other demographics? We'll talk about that. But the psychedelic science research community, including researchers, study leaders, biotech leaders, the majority are white. Representation among PIs and researchers, this influences what the study priorities are. What do you notice in your world? That is about your lived experience. And that is also true about the people who are creating the research. That includes recruitment strategies, questions asked, and also not only the cultural relevance, but the scientific relevance of those results. Socioeconomic status was only reported 57% of the time, and immigration status only 4.8% of the time. And that experience itself is such a big part of how we experience the world. But what we do know is that BIPOC people are much more affected by drug policy in terms of legislation and imprisonment. So Black and Latina individuals make up about 76% of people in prison for drug offenses, although we don't really know, like there's no breakdown about psychedelics. I looked for this for a little while. If anybody has that info, I'd like to see. And, what we do know is that white people use drugs at the same or higher rate, depends on the drug, as BIPOC people, but are going to prison much less commonly. So why aren't BIPOC people involved in making the agendas? And I would say that is about being inconvenient to drug companies. Disability demographics, people with disabilities are also considered inconvenient by, people who are doing these studies. Most systematic reviews of psychedelic assisted therapy, randomized control trials show that disability status are not reported in RCTs. So there was a recent systematic review that was done of 21 RCTs on psilocybin and MDMA therapies, did not include disability status among reported demographics. A lot of the time, psychedelic clinical research excludes people with disabilities. Of course, specifically mental health disabilities, but also physical disabilities, because you're not going to get as positive results. It's not going to fit the hypothesis. And we see that psychedelic trials have eligibility criteria that excludes individuals with certain physical or health limitations, eliminating people with physical, sensory, or other disabilities. There are virtually no psychedelic clinical trials that explicitly report participant disability status as part of their demographic data. And I would say the exclusion of inconvenient bodies, including BIPOC people, is one of the many ways that research reifies injustice for people with disabilities. But prisons, 40% of people incarcerated report having a disability, compared with about 15% of the general population. So people with disabilities are being incarcerated, but they are not able to access what are considered some of the breakthrough therapies that exist. And then sexual orientation is reported in about 9.5%. So when we talk about queer trans people, 9.5% of studies, although my colleagues and I just published a paper on gender diverse people and psychedelics this year, really zero studies reported gender identity. Not there are studies that report gender identity about psychedelic usage outside of therapeutic settings, but not reporting gender identity within the clinical setting, within the context of a randomized control or cohort study, within the study environment itself. But actual numbers and data of LGBT individuals are not generally available or are systematically collected. Um, and then there was this large online study, 581 psychedelic users who were not recruited for LGBT status, who reported psychedelic experiences influence their gender identity and expression. 10% reported that. And increased same-sex attraction or gender fluidity. So psychedelics can make you gay, is what it's my joke. And then prisons. We know that particularly women, people who are in women's prison are that women specifically are 4 times more likely than straight women and bisexual women to be arrested than straight men. And there's a lot of theories about this. I won't get into this on this slide because I realize I'm running out of time. But and it's not like we're going to get the information about how many trans people are in prison for drug offenses or any other kind of offenses, which, by the way, I couldn't get that information specifically about LGBT people or people with disabilities in terms of drug offenses. But the Bureau of Justice doesn't respect gender. So why are we going to expect to get good data around trans people from the Bureau of Justice? But NBC News found that there were about 5,000 people locked up in state prisons alone. And the National Transgender Discrimination Survey found 1 in 6 trans people had been incarcerated at some point, and nearly half of Black trans people had been incarcerated. And we know that the drug war is the #1 reason that people are in prison. So I think it's worth it to look at those statistics as well. Or I guess we did. So what is abolition for those of us working in this realm? It means loudly believing that everyone deserves to be free from detention, policing, and imprisonment, regardless of the drugs they choose to use or sell. No trusting governments or pharmaceutical companies to get it right. I mean, why do we expect the research to reflect us when the people who are making the data, which isn't just governments or pharmaceutical industries, and it's also a lot of private companies and billionaires, why do we expect them to get it right? We need to be building, as clinicians, we need to be building networks of people in underground communities, also known as our friends and family. Like when we are using drugs outside of clinical settings, why do we have to consider ourselves in the underground? And we or our clients are not, why do we have to define ourselves that way when we are using whatever drugs we choose to use? I also think it means that we are working to stop the encroachment of prisons and police in our communities, and also building more networks that where we are safe and people are protecting us from police and prisons as much as is possible. It also means to question guidelines that are created without us, that those guidelines are actually for us. And, we can use them as reference, but we know that there's big data missing there. It means doing community-based participatory research. We make our own IRBs. We make our own advisory boards, because seeking permission is not how we gain more rights in this country or more access to these vital medicines. Creating more belonging for those of us with marginalized identity is not going to come from being in a room with someone who cannot hold the oppression that we have experienced. And so not only do we need to be people who can hold the oppression of other people without feeling marginalized, and that's specifically true for white people who do not like to talk about race, who do not like to talk about systematic oppression of people of color. But it also means acknowledging that there are levels of oppression. My experience as a South Asian person, I experienced less racial oppression than Latinx, Indigenous, and Black people in this country. And I have to understand that. I don't need to tell that to my patient, but I need to understand that and bring that knowledge to a room when I am with someone whose body has experienced more marginalization than myself. Um, and we don't experience freedom when people ignore, silence, whitewash, or silverline the way that we are oppressed differently and more. Um, so, the other big thing is people always talk about affordability, like how are we going to make it affordability within institutions? But why can't we say to ourselves, most people are not using drugs in institutions. Why don't we make these other places safer? Why don't we create more underground spaces where people can actually do drugs and feel safe and not wait for the study that's specific to depression for 3 months, even though we have one for 6 months? Like, we can do these things even as the research is happening. And as we strive to make those clinical environments less racist, homophobic, transphobic, ableist. And because the truth is that research takes about 17 years to become practice. Yes, it's faster with psychedelics, but still, when does that translate to practice for a Medicaid or Medicare patient or an undocumented person receiving their care in a safety net hospital? Um, we want more community options for psychedelics to be accessible, more financially accessible. Sorry, I don't know if you can hear the beeping of the giant truck outside my office. Um, but anyway, community options for psychedelics that are more financially accessible, more accessible for people with disabilities, that clinicians are porously within underground networks and care spaces, that we don't take our positions and lord them over people as experts. And that when there are harms in psychedelic spaces that are community spaces, that we use restorative justice frameworks to address those harms. Normalizing people doing what they want with their bodies and mind. That is also about fighting white supremacy. We don't need to pay $300 to access spirit or specialized pharmacists in order to know whether or not we can take psychedelics with our blood pressure medication, that we have more information available. No one should be holding on to the knowledge and then charging people a lot of money in order to access it. Yeah, I mean, I feel like I've said a lot of this, but standing in solidarity and not being an ally, but being a co-conspirator, this helps us decrease disconnection in our lives, period, but also in the world of psychedelics. Okay, that's it. That's my email. I'm glad to take
Thank you so much, Ronica.
yeah.
Um, we have had a few things pop up in the Q&A that I just wanted to highlight. First was a comment from Amy just saying, thank you for stating that psychedelics don't make people good. I often hear that everyone should do psychedelics so the world will become a more compassionate place. And given the right wing's fascination with psychedelics, it's clearly not true. One's intentions and goals are most important in terms of experience and outcome. So I just wanted to highlight that comment. And kind of piggybacking on that, a question that came into the Q&A was, how do psychedelics not amplify anxiety and depression if they are amplifiers, but rather increase coping, self-compassion, powerfulness, flexibility, perspective taking, especially given that state-dependent functions exist?
It's a good question. And really it has to do with the way that psychedelics work in the brain. And I won't give you a long pharmacokinetics lecture because that might be boring for you. But the truth is that, the majority of psychedelics have a serotonin component, or they have, ketamine, which is probably the majority of the psychedelics that we will use in clinical settings is glutamatergic. And then there's like the dopamine, norepinephrine, oxytocin picture of MDMA. And all of them, it comes down to creating some sort of dissociation or association that is different. Like, for example, ketamine, we consider it a dissociative. And that dissociative helps to interrupt what's called the default mode network. And the default mode network is the background noise of the brain. It's that constant negative self-talk, the self-doubt, the worry that we have that we're not enough, the the voices in our head from our childhood that told us that there was something wrong with us. That's what the default mode network is. And any respite we have from the default mode network helps us to recalibrate a bit. And that can happen with any type of psychedelic. And then the associative qualities, for example, of something like MDMA, there's, psilocybin also has some associative qualities that helps us develop not only external compassion, but internal compassion. And that ability to develop compassion for ourselves can help alleviate some of that anxiety. But the question you're asking is also good because it's not like psychedelics don't work for everyone. And that is really important for us to acknowledge. There are many people who feel worse after they take psychedelics. And that needs to be part of the conversation too. But for many people, they do experience these effects that I talked about.
Thank you. Another question was, you mentioned that there's current research going on that's looking to sort of remove the psychedelic experience from sort of the medicine, the treatment effect of these compounds. And I wonder if you could expand on how that is perhaps rooted in white supremacy, or do you see a connection there between the interest in removing the psychedelic experience and so much that you've spoken to about white supremacist frameworks?
I mean, it's such a good question. I would say, what would the intention of the scientists be? And then, what are the outcomes? I think they are different. And also, maybe different scientists have different intentions. I do think that when people are using psychedelics, they're not making money. There's no one who's using MDMA and involved in capital. Maybe there are, but not therapeutically. And probably there are. And yet, and I do think we avoid psychedelics. I don't think most people in the world are psychedelic states are ones that produce someone who is gonna be a better part of civilization. And that is true, right? When we are in psychedelic states, we question, and we should be questioning our relationship to civilization. And that doesn't help reify white supremacy. And the non-psychedelic psychedelics, I mean, psychoplastogens don't do that. What they do is they open up, these glutamate channels, serotonin channels, and increase mTOR, and then, increase our brain-derived neurotropic factor, which is good for us. It's good for us to have new pathways to old thoughts. But the idea isn't to enter into an altered state of consciousness, which is a very useful state in order to reorient to our regular state of consciousness. And our regular state of consciousness is governed by white supremacy. There's no doubt, right? I think we can all agree to that. Maybe we can't all agree to that. And if you disagree, I'd love to hear it.
Well, speaking of kind of the regular state of consciousness, or even this concept of healing, which is, really popular in, I think, white Western spaces. I wonder if maybe the last question you could speak to is, the increase in psychedelic tourism. You mentioned Maria Sabina, whose life ended in poverty, really as a result of what happened to her community due to psychedelic tourism. We're seeing, we have Aaron Rodgers talking about, travels to, I think, Peru or Costa Rica for ayahuasca treatment. If you just wanted to share with our audience a little bit your thoughts on that.
Sorry, what was the original question?
Just the impacts of psychedelic tourism on these communities. Do we feel like there's an awareness of that in the larger Western cultures? People are seeking out these experiences.
I mean, I think we know the answer to that, which is that the West believes that the rest of the world is there for our consumption. We have been taught that. And if there are tools in that part of the world or resources in that part of the world that can make our lives better, then we will choose them and we will take them. And the communities, I was in Iquitos last year, which is in Peru, and it's on the Amazon. It's on a tributary of the Amazon. It's actually on both a tributary and the regular large part of the Amazon. And you can see very clearly there that like all along the river, there's like hundreds of ayahuasca huts that have been built in the forest. You know, the forest, the decimation of the Amazon is happening because of Western tourism. And that's also happening in Mexico. It's happening in Bolivia. It's happening in Costa Rica. It's happening in so many parts of the world because the way that the West consumes is to overconsume. We don't consider our impact when we go to places. And so, you know, the other question that I think is really relevant here is why wouldn't we choose to do these drugs in places, these substances, these plants, and fungi in places where they're legal versus not legal? And I do think that there's something to be said about that, that we need to push to not have drugs be illegal in this country so that we can have a different sort of access to it that isn't necessarily decimating communities in other places. And, you know, in Peru, there's a lot of skepticism around ayahuasca. Like there are so many people who grew up in these indigenous communities where ayahuasca was traditionally a part of their communities who do not want to use it because of the way that Western tourism has affected their communities. And that's like a really kind of big young people movement right now, is resisting the psychedelic imperialism that's happening in Central and South America.
Thank you so much, Ronica. We had another question come in here. Is most scheduling of substances by the government driven by cultural panic?
Mm. I mean, I don't, maybe my answer is yes and no. I think that the answer to the psychedelics ones I've talked about, but um you know, how do I not say that sometimes it's about safety? But it is. Sometimes it is about safety, but yet I don't think it makes us safer, right? We look at Portugal, we look at Holland, and we see that these communities have developed responses to the addiction that happens when drugs are much more accessible. But yet their rates of addiction are much, much lower than our own. And so and those are not perfect either, right? Like decriminalization is not legalization. But there is a lot to say about decriminalization and the fact that it has this particularly affected poor communities much, you know, much less stringently. But I think the majority of the drugs that I've mentioned have there's some cultural component to it for sure. I mean, like, why isn't alcohol illegal? Like alcohol is the number one addictive substance in this country. And it is the one that creates the most birth abnormalities, right? Like we have much more fetal alcohol syndrome than we have opiate overusage as a result of parental drug usage. And yet it is very commonly available. And it is, you know, like that is about lobbying. That is about how powerful the alcohol lobby is in Washington, D.C. I don't feel like I answered that question, but yes and no, I think is the answer.
But it's, yeah, a tough one to answer. So that we're at time for this talk. I want to give a few closing comments. First, many thanks to Ronica for sharing their time, their expertise, and valuable information with us today. Thank you for all of you who attended, for being a part of this event, and for your commitment and efforts to confront racial injustice. Please watch for an email with a link to complete an evaluation on today's presentation, and watch for a separate email regarding CEUs for those that requested them when they registered. Please see our website for information on the remaining conference sessions for today, including this afternoon's breakout sessions, which begin at 12 p.m. Central. Those are on Zoom. And then our closing plenary with Prentice Hemphill, which begins at 2 p.m. Central, and that's on YouTube. But you can find all of those links on our conference website. Thanks again, everyone, for being here. Thank you, Ronica, and enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.